Paul McCartney spent decades hiding his true feelings about one woman. She walked into Beatles recording sessions in 1968 and destroyed everything. She used their instruments without permission. She broke their sacred guy thing rule. The other Beatles hated her presence too. Paul felt pushed aside as his best friend chose her over the band. In 2023, he finally confessed the uncomfortable truth. This woman didn't just break up the Beatles. She broke Paul's heart in ways no one understood. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, right in the middle of World War II. Liverpool was being bombed constantly by German planes, and families like his had to hide underground almost every night. His father, Jim, worked in cotton sales, while his mother, Mary, was a nurse at Walton Hospital, the same place where Paul was born. The family lived dangerously close to the docks, which were always under attack. When Paul was born, his father joked that he looked terrible, like a piece of red meat with one eye open, crying nonstop. That rough beginning during a time of bombs and blackouts shaped how Paul would see the world. When Paul was just 5 years old, he had already learned to fight. He remembered hitting a boy with a metal bar and getting told off in front of the whole school. He needed that toughness later, especially after passing the 11+ exam, which got him into the Liverpool Institute. But his success didn't make life easier because his mother was Catholic and his father was Protestant. He became a target. The other boys, mostly from Protestant families, bullied him harshly. Every day at school felt like a battle, and Paul learned to protect himself. These early struggles stuck with him and would later show up in songs that talked about survival and standing strong. Paul's toughest moment came in 1956. On October 31st, his mother died from breast cancer. She was only 47. Paul was just 14 and couldn't believe it. She had kept the illness a secret, and after surgery, she passed from a blood clot. Paul's first thought was heartbreaking. He asked what they would do without her money. Mary had been the main breadwinner. His last memory of her was teasing her for how she said the word ask. That guilt never left him. Just a few months later, he wrote his first song, "I Lost My Little Girl," as a way to process his grief. That loss would stay deep inside him. And years later, when he dreamed of her telling him everything would be okay, it inspired one of his most famous songs, "Let It Be." Paul's father, Jim, was more than a salesman. He was a talented musician who played piano and trumpet. He had worked at the Hippodrome Theatre in Liverpool and learned music just by listening every night while running the spotlights. In 1957, Jim gave Paul a trumpet, hoping he'd follow in his footsteps. But Paul soon realized he couldn't sing and play trumpet at the same time. So he traded it for a guitar that cost $15. That simple choice completely changed music history. The guitar gave Paul a way to sing and create songs at the same time. His father's love for old music deeply influenced Paul's style, especially his fondness for strong melodies and catchy tunes. Even with school and music, Paul still had to work. In 1958, at age 16, he took on tough jobs just to help the family. He delivered coal during freezing mornings and swept floors at a cotton mill, where the machines were so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. His grandfather had spent his life cutting tobacco at Copp's warehouse, and his father had worked in Liverpool's cotton exchange. These experiences taught Paul about working people, their pain, pride, and humor. It was this world that shaped many of the Beatles' songs that honored everyday life. When Paul was 10 years old in 1952, something terrifying happened. He almost drowned while swimming with friends in one of Liverpool's flooded quarries. These deep pits looked fun, but were deadly. Filled with freezing water and leftover mining equipment, they were traps for children. Paul slipped under, and his friends had to pull him out. Many kids had died in those waters. That scare left him with a fear of swimming that stayed for life, and maybe even a stronger sense of how fragile life could be. Then came the day that changed everything. On July 6, 1957, Paul went to a church fete at St. Peter's in Woolton. It was hot and sunny. He watched a boy named John Lennon play guitar using strange chords he'd learned from his mom. Paul, who was left-handed, flipped John's guitar upside down and played 20 Flight Rock perfectly, singing every word. He also sang Long Tall Sally like a pro. The band couldn't believe it. He could play, sing, tune guitars, and knew all the hits. That moment was the beginning of a partnership that would shake the world. 2 weeks later, Pete Shotton saw Paul riding his bike and casually invited him to join John's band, the Quarrymen. Paul said he would after scout camp and a family holiday in Philly. His first real gig with the group came on October 18, 1957. Everyone wore matching jackets. They paid off slowly, bit by bit. What made this even more emotional was that John's mother, Julia, had died just 3 months earlier. Paul understood that pain. He had lost his own mother the year before. That shared grief brought them closer, and their music would carry the emotions they couldn't say out loud. By 1959, Paul and John were skipping school to write songs in Paul's bedroom at 20 Forthland Road. They sat face to face writing and recording ideas using a cheap tape recorder. Their first song together was Too Bad About Sorrows. Then came Just Fun and an instrumental called Looking Glass. They treated songwriting like work, building a notebook filled with over 100 songs long before they were famous. This was the foundation of their future success. But not everything went smoothly. On that same first Quarrymen performance in October 1957, Paul had one job: play a solo on Guitar Boogie. He had practiced it again and again, but when the moment came, nerves got the better of him. He froze, stumbled through the song, and felt completely humiliated. He nearly quit music altogether. But instead of giving up, he decided he wasn't cut out to be a lead guitarist. That failure made him realize they needed someone better, which led to George Harrison joining in early 1958. That change would shape the band forever. In May 1960, Paul took on a stage name during a chaotic tour in Scotland. For 8 days, the band played behind singer Johnny Gentle. Paul called himself Paul Ramone, trying to sound fancy. They traveled in a cramped van, stayed in dodgy places, and weren't even listed on the posters. The tour was a disaster, but Paul remembered Scottish girls asking if that was his real name. Despite the mess, it gave him a taste of the road life. Then came Hamburg. On August 17, 1960, the Beatles began playing at the Indra Club in Germany's red light district. They performed for hours every night, 4.5 hours on weekdays and 6 hours on Saturdays. The place was full of strip clubs and rough crowds. They earned just a few marks each, barely enough for food. But this grind made them better. Club owners would shout at them to put on a show, and they did. John would act wild on stage, and they started developing a real performance style. George later said that Hamburg is where they truly became a band. During their time in Hamburg, Paul made a big decision. When Stuart Sutcliffe left the group in 1961, they needed a new bassist. Paul didn't want the role, but he took it anyway. He bought a Höfner violin bass from a local music shop. That bass became iconic. He used it on the band's early albums and singles like She Loves You. His melodic bass playing changed how people saw the bass guitar. It wasn't just background anymore. It became part of the song's heart. Everything shifted when they met Brian Epstein. On November 9th, 1961, he saw them play at the Cavern Club and immediately thought they had something special. Just a few weeks later, on December 3rd, he offered to manage them. He had no experience, but his style and confidence impressed them. Their parents liked him too, and soon he was guiding the group towards something much bigger. The biggest controversy hit in August 1962. John invited Ringo Starr to join the band. Just 2 days later, Pete Best was out. Fans were furious. Some protested outside Pete's house, and George even got punched by an angry supporter. At Ringo's first recording session, the producer didn't trust him and used a session drummer instead. Ringo thought he might be kicked out too. But in the end, the new lineup clicked, and it changed everything. Their first single, Love Me Do, came out on October 5th, 1962. It didn't top the charts right away, but reached number 17 in the UK by November. Paul sang harmony and played bass while John handled the harmonica. They recorded 3 versions with different drummers. When the song finally came to the US in 1964, it hit number 1. That was their 4th US number 1 hit in the same year, breaking records and launching them to global fame. It all began on February 9th to 1964, when 4 young men from Liverpool stepped onto the Ed Sullivan Show stage and changed the world. That Sunday evening, over 73 million viewers tuned in across America. For millions of teenagers, it was the first time they had seen or heard the Beatles, and the impact was immediate. Screaming fans, flashing lights, and the sound of 4 mop-haired boys playing guitars transformed a simple TV broadcast into a historic cultural moment. The Beatles opened with All My Loving, followed by Paul singing Till There Was You, and ending the first set with She Loves You. Their charm, energy, and style sparked what would soon be called Beatlemania. In just a matter of hours, America had fallen in love. Overnight, the Beatles became a household name in the United States. Radio stations couldn't play their songs fast enough. Stores sold out of Beatles records within days. Young fans covered their school books with pictures of Paul, John, George, and Ringo. Within a month, the Beatles had 5 songs in the Billboard Top 10 simultaneously, including Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, and Please Please Me. It was a kind of music explosion that had never been seen before. Their popularity wasn't just limited to music. The Beatles changed fashion, language, and attitude. Their collarless suits, Cuban-heeled boots, and shaggy haircuts became iconic. Every move they made was front-page news. Teenage boys copied their style, while girls dreamed about marrying one of them. Beatle boots became a must-have, and fans lined up for hours just to catch a glimpse of them at airports and concert venues. But it wasn't just about the image. The Beatles' music stood out because it was fresh, melodic, and full of harmonies that felt new. Paul and John's songwriting partnership, honed through years of playing together in Liverpool and Hamburg, was at its creative peak. The lyrics were simple but deeply relatable: love, heartbreak, hope, and the melodies stuck in your head. Their songs could be played on acoustic guitars at home or blasted on radios in cars, and they still hit the same. The Beatles didn't stop. By the summer of 1964, they were back in the studio, releasing A Hard Day's Night, along with a feature-length film of the same name. The movie was a hit. Shot in black and white, it followed a fictional day in the life of the Beatles, mixing humor with chaos and music. Paul's grandfather was played by Wilfrid Bramble, and his line, "He's very clean," became a running joke. The film wasn't just a commercial success, it was a critical one. Critics called it smart, funny, and surprisingly artistic. Even non-fans couldn't deny that the Beatles were more than just a pop act. By the end of 1964, the Beatles were the biggest band in the world. Their concerts in the US drew massive crowds, with fans screaming so loudly that the band couldn't hear themselves on stage. One of their most famous performances came at the Hollywood Bowl, where thousands of girls sobbed, screamed, and even fainted. Police had to hold back crowds, and ambulances waited outside just in case. That level of hysteria would follow them everywhere. In August 1965, they performed at Shea Stadium in New York. It was the first major stadium concert in music history. Over 55,000 fans packed the stadium, and the Beatles played through a tiny sound system designed for sports announcements. They couldn't hear their own instruments. Paul later said it felt like playing inside a vacuum of sound and chaos. But even so, the moment was electric. That night changed live music forever and proved rock and roll could fill stadiums. Even with the madness of touring, Paul and the band kept evolving musically. Their 1965 album, Rubber Soul, marked a shift. The songs were deeper, more experimental. Paul wrote Michelle, with its French lyrics and tender feel, while John delivered introspective tracks like In My Life. The Beatles were no longer just writing pop songs. They were making art. And Paul, always a perfectionist, started pushing the band to explore new instruments, unusual chord progressions, and sophisticated arrangements. In 1966, they released Revolver, widely considered one of the most groundbreaking albums in music history. Paul's Eleanor Rigby stood out. It was just a string quartet and vocals, no guitars or drums. The song's themes of loneliness and death were a stark contrast to their earlier love songs. Critics and fans alike praised its maturity. Paul was proving he could be more than a pop songwriter. He was a composer, an innovator. But with their music growing more complex, the limitations of live shows became obvious. After a harrowing tour of the Philippines, where they were physically threatened and nearly attacked for unintentionally snubbing the First Lady, and after dealing with growing hostility during their American tour, partly due to John's infamous comment that they were more popular than Jesus, the band decided to stop touring altogether in 1966. This decision gave Paul room to fully unleash his creative instincts in the studio. In 1967, they began work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul led the concept, imagining a fictional band to free themselves from their Beatles identity. The result was a psychedelic, genre-defying album that blended rock, classical music, Indian influences, circus sounds, and studio wizardry. Paul's When I'm 64 and Lovely Rita balanced John's stranger pieces like Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. The album became a cultural landmark, often credited with changing what albums could be. That same year, the Beatles performed All You Need Is Love live on the first ever global satellite TV broadcast, watched by an estimated 400 million people. Paul stood among the orchestra, playing bass, grinning as the song's simple message echoed across the world. It was a moment that showed how far they'd come, from a small club in Liverpool to leading the planet's biggest musical event. But the pressures kept building. By 1968, the band was beginning to fracture. Paul, ever the workhorse, pushed the band to keep producing. They traveled to India to study meditation with the Maharishi, and while Paul tried to stay focused, the atmosphere had changed. They returned with dozens of new songs, many of which would become part of the White Album. But instead of unity, the sessions were tense. Arguments flared. Paul, trying to maintain order, found himself at odds with George, John, and even Ringo at times. Paul still wrote some of the album's most memorable songs: Blackbird, inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, and Mother Nature's Son, written after a long walk alone. But the magic was becoming harder to recapture. Still, even with the tension, their music kept evolving, kept reaching new heights. The following year, 1969, brought Abbey Road. Paul came up with the iconic Side 2 medley, stringing together unfinished song fragments into a seamless suite. He wanted it to feel like a final statement, a farewell. You Never Give Me Your Money, Golden Slumbers, and Carry That Weight told the story of a band trying to hold on. The final track, The End, featured each member taking a solo: Paul, George, and even Ringo on drums. It closed with the line, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make." It was Paul's message, one last reminder of everything they'd been through. They were falling apart, but the music never did. Even in those last moments, Paul gave everything: his voice, his bass lines, his leadership. It carried the band across the finish line. And on that February night in 1964, when they first played All My Loving on Ed Sullivan, none of them could have known just how far they would go. But from that single performance, a revolution began. One that would shape not only Paul McCartney's life, but the future of music, fashion, culture, and everything that came after.